Great, thank you so much. I am indeed up for a challenge and I'm very energised after those amazing sessions full of wisdom from Nora and from Sian. And what I want to do today is to take a moment just at the start of our session to reflect a little bit on those learnings. So I'll do that in a second. And then following that, I'm going to be talking about some of the big trends that I'm seeing, firstly from the heritage sector, but also from the broader not-for-profit space. About digital literacy for leaders, and I think there's a lot of crossover with the fantastic insights from Nora and Sian. And we're talking about pitfalls as well, what leaders shouldn't be doing, because I do think that digital skills for leaders are quite a distinct thing, and I'll say a bit more about that later. And then finally, I'm going to take you through a quick case study of a leader from the heritage sector who has moved on in leaps and bounds with digital skills during this time, and really flexed a range of muscles there in the way they have developed those skills. So I will take you through that as well. So firstly, if we can just take a minute to reflect on all of those fantastic insights that we had there from Nora and Sian. There were just 3 points which stood out for me from both of those sessions. And I think they really set the scene for a fantastic discussion this afternoon and the questions that I'm sure that you have. Firstly, from Nora, I love this point around horizon scanning being a skill in itself, something that you really need to move forward with digital. And I think on the road to recovery phase of the pandemic, we've all got an opportunity right now to look up and out. What are other heritage organisations doing in digital skills? What's going on beyond the wider sector? So I think that's a great thing to do. And I also loved Nora's point about user-led skills. What are the people that we are trying to support doing with their digital skills? What journey are they on? To what extent do we need to keep pace with that, or even to lead that? What are we aiming for there? So I thought that was also a fantastic insight. And a theme that Nora raised, which came up again also in Sian's presentation, was about collaboration, about learning together, about the democratization of these spaces where we all come together and we really focus on continuous learning. And then from Sian's presentation, I love this point about, well, how do you develop the right digital skills when the institution, you know, this fantastic historical institution, this national treasure, may need to change as well. So the fact that we're all pioneering this work around digital skills, what does that then mean for the organisations within which we're working? How might that organisation then need to adapt? So that really got me thinking. And then Sian's point about the mindset shift and continuous learning is one I'm sure we're going to be exploring a lot more today. And then how you feed that love of learning into your culture and where you do it, how you do it, I think is such a great point. It's something we all need to consider as we plan these opportunities for learning. And then I also love Sian's point about getting people to think about the digital skills that they have gained outside of work. A big thing I see right across the not-for-profit space is sometimes people coming to work with maybe some quite good digital skills that they have developed, perhaps from another job or even in their personal life, when they're perhaps not quite sure what they're empowered to do. So there's something here about crossing that divide between work and home and people's other professional skills, and thinking about how we bring those digital skills in and how we encourage our staff to do that. So moving on from those 3 fantastic learnings from our 2 fantastic speakers, I wanted to say a little bit about where I see the role of skills, because I think this is often a big question that we ask in organisations. Where do skills sit? Where should they be? And I think that digital skills are very much the golden thread that should run through a lot of what we do. It's hard to think of a digital project or even perhaps an offline project where it wouldn't be significantly improved by having some really good digital skills in the mix, whether that's content, whether it's fundraising, whether it's the way you deliver your services, as both Nora and Sian described earlier. And the way I like to describe this is that it's a bit like an iceberg. So let's take an example that's happening right now, I'm sure, across the heritage sector and indeed the wider charity and not-for-profit space as well. I'm sure there'll be people on this call who are going through the joys of putting in a new CRM or a new website. And of course, with those projects, it's so easy to really look at what's going on the surface and to focus on the product itself. But the thing that's going to really drive the change, the thing that's actually underneath the surface that we may not always be aware of or see, is the digital skills that we're going to get our staff and our volunteers and our trustees to develop that are going to make that project a success. So that's why I always like to get people to think about digital skills as an iceberg, because if you don't get that right in the context of a big project and your wider work, it's something that could become perhaps a bit of a pitfall later on. So moving on from icebergs, hopefully to something a little bit more cheery, there was some wonderful data from the DASH survey. So I just wanted to flag some really interesting insights from that. And I've included the link to the source here at the bottom, as well as the Heritage Digital Academy's fantastic courses. So I wanted to pick out just 3 learnings, which I thought were very sort of interesting in terms of our discussion this afternoon, very relevant for that. So the first thing is that there's this growing confidence in digital skills. So we can see here this point about getting confident with video conferencing, and that mirrors one of the trends we saw in the Charity Digital Skills Survey last year, where there is this growing sense of confidence in digital skills across the sector. What's really interesting, and perhaps a slight point of divergence with the report I'm involved in, but I think is a really important trend across the heritage space, is this point about being face-to-face and how that can potentially help grow digital skills. So I thought that was a really interesting point and something to factor into how we draw and entice employees back to the office. And obviously many of us are working in a hybrid or indeed a remote way now, but perhaps some of us are coming back together occasionally, learning and collaborating. So that may be something we can deploy to help make the most of staff's time when they brave the tube or the train and come into the office. And then a third point, which I think sets the scene quite nicely for some other things I'm going to touch on a bit later in this presentation, is that senior staff didn't actually discuss their own digital skills that much, even during meetings where you think it would be very formal and appropriate, like an appraisal. I thought that's a very interesting point about how the culture around discussing skills and that ownership of skills changes as you get further up the food chain. And we need to think about how we make that more of an everyday item that leaders feel they should discuss, because what I've seen time and again in every organisation I've ever worked with is that if the leaders are open about their own digital skills gap, that then gives their staff and their volunteers the permission to say, actually, I'd like to develop these skills, and can you give me some support to do that? Okay, so let's think about what types of digital skills heritage leaders need. And actually, I think this is probably an area where there's a lot of synergy across all sorts of sectors. It's an interesting question, I think, at leadership level, because there's something here about what technical digital skills and what types of skills do I actually really need if I'm, say, the CEO or the director or head of or a manager. And I think these fall into 3 categories. The first thing is perhaps the doing skills. So there's kind of day-to-day skills you might need in your job. So for example, if you are involved in finance, then you're going to need a good sort of working knowledge of Excel. There's no 2 ways about it. But then there's 2 skills which I think are really relevant we lead and how we have oversight. So there's something there about understanding. So where you don't necessarily need to be a technical expert, but you need to know enough about when there are skills gaps, when you need to take advice on getting more of those skills through the door, perhaps from hiring a freelancer or bringing in another member of staff. So that's where you need an understanding, but not necessarily the technical knowledge. And then finally, I think there's a point about how leadership skills are changing. And whilst they may not be digital skills per se, there's something here about modern leadership skills that are really needed to drive digital transformation. And we're back to the points we discussed earlier about collaboration, but also about strategy and having that knowledge of agile and service design, which I think is so important for digital projects. Moving on, let's look at some learning trends here. So firstly, in the Charity Digital Skills Report, I'm just going to briefly touch on some trends from last year. There was a real sense of informal learning, and I think that speaks to the points that Nora and Sian raised as well, about peer learning and coming together and doing this in a really collaborative way. So my top tip here is when our staff and volunteers learning and they might not realise they're learning. So that could be things like team meetings, as Sian mentioned. It could be when they call the IT help desk with a problem. It could be when they're having a one-to-one session with their manager. Think about how you can fold those learning opportunities into the day-to-day workings of your organisation, so you start to develop more of a learning culture. And then 3 tips that I would give then for growing heritage leaders' digital skills, and these again reference the Charity Digital Skills books. I think they're pretty relevant to any sector. There's something here about how you develop your North Star, and that's as much a test of your strategy skills as your digital skills. We need really sound digital visions that speak to the visions and missions of our organisations. And again, it's those horizon scanning skills. What trends are out there with digital? How are they going to impact your organisation? What do you need to do about them? I think that's a muscle that perhaps doesn't get flexed quite enough, and leaders need to really develop that. And then the third point is about developing, but also embedding digital strategies. And I can't say that enough, really, because when I think of embedding, it's very much about how do you capitalise on the progress you've made during the pandemic, and where do you go next? Let's move on and think about pitfalls. Well, not doing the things that I mentioned is obviously not a good thing to do. But then I think there's also that sense of not nurturing some of these digital skills, so not encouraging people to collaborate. And a lovely description that I read of leadership and how that's shifting post-pandemic, which I think is partly a digital skill as well, is how might leaders create those moments of energy which really encourage the team together and collaborate. And that's so fundamental to the ethos of digital, but also where I think all of our organisations are going in the future. And then finally, there's a really important point here about inclusion. Obviously, digital may not be for everyone, and staff and volunteers may be at different stages with digital skills, and that's fair enough. And I think Sian highlighted that really well in her presentation. So we need to think about how we create that balancing act between our digital ambitions as leaders, but also making sure that we bring as many people with us as possible on the journey and give them the support that they need. So just on a heritage leader who's developed their digital skills, Stuart Murphy, who's CEO of English National Opera, there's an episode of our podcast where he talks about the digital skills he developed during the pandemic. And actually, they were almost traditional skills that got repurposed in the way in which they were having to be a lot more digital. So things like new ways of doing internal comms, being much more transparent and open as a leader, really leading with your values through digital, and fostering more of those moments of peer learning and innovation. So what Stuart and his team did beautifully was really use digital skills to mark a step change and to drive that step change in their culture and how they operate and connect with a more diverse, younger supporter base, as much as strengthening relationships with the more traditional supporters that they might have. So please do take a listen to this and check out Stuart's amazing, inspiring story. And just one final thing to say, if you are a charity or indeed any other kind of non-profit organisation, we would love to hear from you in the Charity Digital Skills Report Survey. It's a bit of an annual barometer of where the social sectors act with digital. So please do get involved in that if you can. We'll be using the results to influence funders right across the sector. So we'll be creating a resource that will make a big difference, I'm sure, to everyone on this call. So please do share your opinions on that as well. And finally, I just wanted to say that what we have sort of talked about today is we've discussed types of digital skills. We've also talked about what leaders can do with them. So whether that's innovating, whether that is shifting your business model, whether that's new ways of generating income, or whether it's just about reimagining your future. And skills, I think, are in some ways a means to an end. It's about the opportunities they open up and the different people we can create relationships with to help our organisations achieve even more progress. Thank you for listening.